So pernickety about communication, it drives me round the bend. From his point of view, it's simply making sure we're absolutely straight and we know exactly what we're doing, how we look at things in two different ways. So Chris will go over details as to how we're going to get somewhere and where we're going to meet. And today he's cooking the lunch and, this is, and where's this going and where's this going? And I'm thinking, can't you just cook it? I just said, this is the dish, and why can't you just do it? But no, minute by minute, it needs a breakdown. Communication is difficult, isn't it? Because you can have people who go about communication in one way, people who go about communication in another way, and very often what we think we've said isn't what's been heard. And the communication falls down. And it's so hard to know sometimes, unless you're in the middle of an argument and you're certain that you're right, whether it's you that said something wrong or whether it's the person listening who hasn't heard the right thing. And it struck me reading this passage today that there are two bits of miscommunication that are going on. And the first one, although I sort of hesitated to say this because I thought, am I actually allowed to say this? But I'm going to, so you can tell me afterwards whether I'm allowed to say this or not. But it struck me that what Jesus said to the disciples was, he knew, I think, that it would be misunderstood. Okay, I'm not saying that he deliberately told them the wrong thing, it wasn't the right thing, but I think he understood that they wouldn't understand. So let me just read the bit that I'm talking about. So he's teaching his disciples and he says to them, so this is just the 12, it's not the crowds and so forth, this is just the 12. The Son of Man, which they knew was him, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. Okay? The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. They, the disciples, did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask. Now, I have some sympathy with the disciples because in Mark's Gospel up to now, Jesus has been talking largely in parables. So he says a story, and what he wants people to understand is not the story, but the message behind it. So now the disciples are told something, and I think they think, is this a parable? What is the hidden message behind it? Whereas you and I, and they later on, will understand there isn't a message behind it, this is it. This is what's going to happen. But for them, they've been used to, here's the story, now what does it mean? And when he says the Son of Man is going to die and rise again, I think they think, well, that's not the real thing. Now, what's the picture? What's going on behind it? So I do have some sympathy as to where they are in this when they said they didn't understand. So what were the things in particular that they didn't understand? First of all, they didn't understand that the Son of Man, the Messiah, must die. Okay, they did not understand that. And it's not surprising that they didn't understand that. For decades, for centuries, the Jewish faith believed that a Messiah would come and would get rid of the Romans, and the Jews would be left free in Jerusalem to worship God as they believed was right. And here is Jesus saying, the Son of Man must die. What good is that? You need an army. You need people to fight the Romans. You need people to get rid of them. And here he is saying, the Son of Man must die. Just a chapter before, when Jesus said these words again, Peter said to him, you're wrong, you've got that wrong, it can't be. Can you imagine saying to Jesus, you're wrong? What a nerve he had, maybe a lack of understanding. And Jesus said, no, I am right. This is what must happen. The Messiah is not going to be somebody who's coming in great power, in great authority. He's not going to come on a military basis. The Messiah is going to come as somebody who will be a servant, somebody who will set people free, but not with an army. So what didn't they understand? They didn't understand that the Messiah must die. And the other thing that they didn't understand, and I found this really quite interesting, is the idea that the Son of Man must come back to life again. Now, obviously, that's an extraordinary thing to say. If we weren't Christians, if we hadn't been brought up knowing about the resurrection, if somebody said to us, oh, this person's going to die and come back to life, we would say, you what? What are you talking about? But for them in particular, what they didn't understand was that one person was going to come back to life. Because the Jewish faith had told them that everybody would come back to life at the end of time. So they were expecting that. What they were not expecting, that just one person, the Messiah, would come back to life. So they've got a major problem. Jesus says to them, I am going to die. If he dies, he can't be the Messiah, but they think he is. And I will come back to life. And they're thinking, why just you? Why isn't it all of us? They did not understand. And maybe it's not surprising. And I thought to myself, I wonder if, not perhaps on those issues, because we've got the whole of the Bible to guide us, but are there times when Jesus is telling us something over and over again, and we do not understand? We do not take it on board because we're in our traditions, but we've been taught this. So what you're saying can't possibly be right. Or we're within our friendship groups. This is how we behave. You can't be asking us to do something completely different. Maybe the message is coming at us from lots of different places, from the Bible, maybe from a home group, maybe it's coming at us through Christian friends, maybe it's coming at us through what we're thinking about when we're going for a walk or when we're going to work or when we're looking after children. The message comes to us like Jesus gave his disciples over and over again. I have come to die and I will rise again. And they could not understand it. And I thought, are we those disciples? Is the message for us coming through? And we're saying, we've no idea what you're talking about, so I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to leave it. I'll put it to one side, and the message keeps coming back. So miscommunication. Jesus was saying one thing. The disciples, they really couldn't take it on board. And I wonder, is that miscommunication sometimes where we're at? That Jesus is trying to communicate and we can't really hear. And then the second bit of miscommunication, the other way round this time. This little bit makes me laugh, if I'm honest. So we've heard Jesus saying, I've got to die and I'll come back to life again. The disciples don't understand. Then they came to Capernaum. When Jesus was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet because they had argued about who was the greatest. I don't know whether you have children. I don't know if you remember when you were a child, but can you remember times when maybe you were having some great argument, or maybe with a friend, and then somebody turns around and says, well, what's the problem? What's the discussion? You know, why aren't you happy? And suddenly you realise that what you were arguing about was just nothing. You know, what on earth were we arguing about who was going to have that sweet when actually there are much bigger issues? And the same thing happens here. What we've got here is Jesus saying some of the biggest teaching that he's got. I must die and rise again. And blow me down, he turns round and the disciples have been arguing about who's the most important. I mean, what was that about? You know, can you see the poignancy of that? This great teacher, this great teaching of what the Messiah must be like, actually it's fallen on deaf ears because the disciples are caught up with who's the most important person. And then this embarrassment, Jesus says, okay, what were you talking about? Silence. Absolute. I mean, who was going to say, oh, well, actually, we were arguing about who was the most important person, Jesus, while you were talking about dying for the rest of the sins of the world. Nobody's going to say that, are they? they kept quiet. They were sort of shamed, as it were, into silence. They couldn't respond. And I thought to myself, miscommunication. They deliberately chose not to tell Jesus what they were arguing about. And this I find such an interesting thing, because I know that I am so guilty of turning to prayer, coming to church, and thinking that I'm telling Jesus about my life. Thinking, I'll tell him about this bit, and I'll tell him about that bit. Other bit, I think I'll leave it. And the irony is, he already knows it all. There's no point in that. He already knows it all. So my attempts to misinform God, to to confess this sin, to say that I did this or I didn't do that, but keep quiet about the thoughts that I had, is pointless. God's already there. He already knows it. So miscommunication. The disciples didn't understand Jesus, and the disciples tried to keep from Jesus what they didn't want him to know. And then he goes a little bit further, and I think this is maybe equally difficult. So they've been arguing, who's the greatest? And he said, sitting down, Jesus was a bit like a rabbi to his disciples, and when a rabbi wanted to teach something important, he sat down. So sitting down with his 12, so this is important teaching that he's doing. He says, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. The fact that it's a child is not the important thing. The point is that this is somebody who has no influence. This is somebody in those days who has no importance, who has virtually no value. That's quite hard, I think, for us to see, because I think our culture has changed and we now see children for the value that they have and the importance that they play in our culture, in our families, in our church and so forth. So I wonder who we would say Jesus would pick today. Who are the powerless? Who are the people who have virtually no influence? And Jesus takes that person and puts that person in the middle of those 12 disciples who are arguing, I'm bigger than you, I'm more important than you. Jesus really likes me, doesn't really like you. Jesus doesn't really listen to you. Jesus says that what I said here was really good, aren't I important? And he takes that powerless person, I don't know, maybe a refugee, somebody who's struggled to get to a place of safety, who has so little power that they're dependent on the care of a state or a church or a loving community, and puts them there and says, effectively, this is what you must be like. This is what you must be like. You must be at the back of the queue. That's where you should be fighting for, not to be at the front of the queue. This is where I, Jesus, am. I'm not here with the guns. Probably didn't have guns then, did they? But the swords and the horses. I'm not here to win people like that. I'm here to win people, to show people a new way of life through love, care, and compassion. Miscommunication. The disciples didn't understand Jesus at that point, but they did later on. Miscommunication as the disciples tried to hide from Jesus what it was that they were actually doing. And this central message that the first shall be last, or the other way round. If we are followers of Jesus, then he was powerless in the eyes of the world, and yet powerful and influential in changing the world upside down, as he's done for so many of us in this church today and outside. The message for us, are we listening to what Jesus is trying to get through to us? Are we honest with Jesus in our relationship with him? Or are we still trying to hide things? And do we take seriously the idea that the most important person is not the politician, it's not the leaders of the media, it's not the sports person, important though they are. The most important person who can show God's way of love is that needy person, the person who needs looking after, who can show the world and show us that care, compassion and love changes the world, and not power, authority and might. So before we turn to our prayers, we're going to sing again now. I've now forgotten, I'm sorry. I know it's got the word encouragement.